Lewis Nixon is one of the most likable characters in Band of Brothers, and he's superbly portrayed by actor Ron Livingston. Nixon was close friends with Richard Winters, which explains why Nixon has an outsized role in Band of Brothers. Author Stephen Ambrose, who wrote the book on which the HBO miniseries is based, relied heavily on interviews with Richard Winters, who was biased toward Nixon and was Nixon's chief defender. The two had met at Army Officer Candidate School at Fort Benning in the spring of 1942 and formed what would be a lifelong friendship. To the casual observer, the two men couldn't be more opposite. Nixon was an alcoholic who liked to hit the town, and Winters didn't drink at all and preferred to stay in the barracks. Yet, as Winters noted in his memoir, despite their differences in lifestyle, they both looked at life in similar ways. If you recall, it was Richard Winters who convinced Colonel Robert Sink to allow Lewis Nixon to remain in the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment after Colonel Sink had grown tired of Nixon's drinking and demoted him. As much as I personally like Nixon's character in the series, I wish I could say that Nixon was equally likable in real life. But based on comments made and not made by some of the veterans, this doesn't seem to be the case. In this video, we're going to hear Lieutenant Lynn Buck Compton's choice words about Lewis Nixon. But first, it's worth taking a moment to get to know both men in order to understand what made Nixon dislike Buck Compton. Born in 1918, Lewis Nixon had grown up with a silver spoon in his mouth. His family owned Nixon Nitration Works in New Jersey, and he had spent his youth divided between Manhattan and Montecito, California. He graduated from the prestigious Capt School, a boarding school near Santa Barbara. He then studied engineering at Yale University for 2 years between 1937 and 1939, and he took summer courses in engineering at MIT. He returned to work at Nixon Nitration Works before enlisting in the Army in January 1941. By that point, Lewis Nixon was a hard-drinking Ivy Leaguer who had spent time traveling across Europe before World War II fractured the continent. He had visited England, France, and Germany prior to Hitler rising to power. Like in the series, Lewis Nixon trained as part of the newly formed Easy Company 2nd Battalion, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division alongside his buddy Richard Winters at Camp Toccoa in Georgia. It was there that the men were under the strict control of Captain Herbert Sobel, memorably portrayed by actor David Schwimmer in Band of Brothers. However, by the time the men arrived in Aldbourne, England, Lewis Nixon was no longer a member of Easy Company. He had been promoted to staff, serving as Battalion S2, or Intelligence Officer. Nixon often operated on his own relaxed terms, including sleeping in and refusing to shave, the latter of which earned him the nickname Blackbeard. Private David Kenyon Webster said that Nixon was a blasé young man who slouched and never raised his voice, and who made quite a thing out of being a Yale man. Lynn Buck Compton, who we'll hear from in a moment, had a less prestigious upbringing than Lewis Nixon. He was born in Los Angeles in 1921, and early on, he opted to give himself the less feminine-sounding nickname, Buck. Buck Compton wasn't one of the original members of Easy Company. He wasn't assigned to the company until December 1943, after Easy was already stationed overseas in Aldbourne, England. He arrived as a replacement second lieutenant and assistant platoon commander. As Compton recalled, it took some time for the men to warm up to him. After all, he hadn't endured the wrath of Captain Herbert Sobel at Camp Toccoa, which had helped to forge a bond between the men. "I remember feeling rather envious of those who had been at Toccoa," Compton wrote years later, "and felt sort of out of it as a new member of the company." It didn't help that Captain Lewis Nixon took an almost immediate dislike to him. Prior to enlisting, Buck Compton had been a standout athlete at UCLA. He was an All-American catcher on UCLA's baseball team, playing alongside Jackie Robinson. He also played as a two-way guard on UCLA's football team and took part in the 1943 Rose Bowl game. UCLA lost the game 9-0 to Georgia. After he joined the Army in 1943, he played on the regimental baseball team at Fort Benning in Georgia. However, he felt useless stateside and wanted to get into the fight, so he applied for the paratroopers. This is how he eventually ended up being assigned to Easy Company when they were stationed in Aldbourne, England, and it's how he encountered Lewis Nixon, then Battalion S2. As stated in Stephen Ambrose's book, the flamboyant Lewis Nixon resented jocks. He was a wealthy, well-educated, alcohol-addicted party boy who didn't understand the need to prove oneself through sports. In his world, status and intelligence were more highly regarded than physical ability. This explains the dislike he took to Buck Compton, an outgoing All-American athlete who became well-liked by the men. During an interview conducted on May 2, 2007, Buck Compton shared his not-so-pleasant opinion of Lewis Nixon as he recalled one of their encounters during the war. Let's now listen to what he had to say. After the clip, I'll tell you the story of what Lewis Nixon called Buck Compton at a reunion after the war.
Captain Nixon had three combat jumps? Yeah, 3 combat jumps.
I guess. I don't know. Nixon was not one of my favorite people.
Well, he seemed to have a drinking problem.
Well, more than that, he was just a prick, if you want to know.
Do you think he was accurately portrayed in the film, or did they?
Pretty much, yeah. He's a sullen, just not a likable guy at all. He took a particular dislike of me for some reason,
Well, if you listen to General MacArthur's speech, Duty, Honor, Country, and what it means to be an officer and a gentleman, and the phrase gentleman there is not, he may have meant a gender specific, but it's not. Today we view it as a gentleman being a woman also who has the characteristics of an Army officer. Nixon never had that. He was a drunk. And he stayed in staff jobs because really you didn't need him leading men in war. That's my view of it.
Well, really what he did, am I taking too much time here?
No.
After Normandy, we're back in Aldbourne. We're sitting around. Somehow, I don't know, because he's on the battalion staff, and,
right.
That's a mile away from a platoon leader, normally in a rifle company, because battalion staff is up the line. Somebody, I'm sitting there outdoors in this little town, and he's there, and we're talking. And I can't tell you how it came about. And just gratuitously, out of the clear blue, he said, he says, I got no damn use for you jocks. And I said, okay, And he said, you're a bunch of jerks. He says, when I was in college, he says, I had girlfriends and we used to party a lot, and you're out sweating and practicing, and I said, well, everybody to his own thing, and so then he said, what I'm going to do with you, and he really had no direct control of him. He's a staff man at battalion headquarters, and
I believe he was the assistant S2, or was the S2?
Yeah, he was S2 at battalion, but anyway, he said, I'm going to make you the battalion physical fitness officer. And I said, okay. He said, every morning, he said, I want you to have this whole battalion out on the road. I want on an hour's run. I said, fine. So out comes the order. Over the battalion commander's signature that Compton, is appointed and so forth. Down at the bottom it says, uniform of the day. Enlisted men, T-shirts, jump pants, and boots. Officers, and there's just one, ODs and a necktie. So I'm out there with a wool shirt and a necktie on, sweating with these guys all with T-shirts on. Now that's Nixon. It's just that, chicken stuff like that. And that's why I say I just never liked the guy.
As Stephen Ambrose noted in the book, it's possible that Lewis Nixon singling out Buck Compton and making him the only officer in charge of physical training for the battalion might have been part of the reason Compton ended up having a close relationship with the NCOs and the enlisted men. Unlike the other officers, as the head of their physical training, Compton spent a significant amount of time with the men, including leading them on long runs, all thanks to Nixon. Easy Company member Edward Babe Heffron later said of Buck Compton, "Buck is not only one of the nicest men I've ever known, a very humble man, but out of all of the officers in Easy Company, Buck was closest to the guys." Compton became especially close to Joe Toye and Bill Garnier. Richard Winters and other officers felt that Compton joking around and gambling with the men was not appropriate behavior for an officer. Not only could it jeopardize his authority over the men, an officer might be reluctant to order an enlisted friend to carry out a dangerous mission. Winters got into a heated argument with Compton about his close relationship with the men. I have little doubt that Winters' friend Lewis Nixon heard about the argument and took an even greater dislike to Compton. In his memoirs, Easy Company veteran Don Malarkey said that during the war, Lewis Nixon was the resident lush at headquarters. Of Nixon's friendship with Richard Winters, Malarkey wrote, "Nobody could figure out why those guys were such close friends. Nixon was a full-blown alcoholic, and Winters didn't drink at all." Malarkey shared a story about Lewis Nixon bad-mouthing Buck Compton at an Easy Company reunion in Dallas. Nixon called Compton a coward for being taken off the line at Bastogne. Officially, Compton was evacuated from Bastogne for a severe case of trench foot, but in the Band of Brothers book, Stephen Ambrose states that Compton had been unnerved after seeing his close friends Bill Garnier and Joe Toye have legs blown almost completely off during an artillery barrage in the woods outside of Foy, Belgium. Ambrose is implying that because Compton became too close to the men he was in charge of, he was more affected when he saw them severely wounded. It seems that Ambrose then concluded on his own that Compton must have not done a good enough job at hiding his trench foot from the medics and used that as an excuse to be removed after having a nervous breakdown. However, in Buck Compton's own autobiography, he refutes this and says that while he was affected by the horrors of Bastogne, "I do not believe I was clinically shell-shocked, as the series portrays me," he said. Immediately after Nixon called Buck Compton a coward at the reunion, Don Malarkey gave Nixon an earful, asking him, "How many silver stars do you have?" Malarkey's comment shut Nixon up. During the war, Buck Compton had been given the Purple Heart, Silver Star, and Bronze Star. Buck Compton and Don Malarkey weren't the only veterans who weren't fond of Lewis Nixon. In fact, other than being mentioned favorably in the memoir of close friend Richard Winters, Nixon is barely mentioned at all in the memoirs of the other veterans, and when he is mentioned, it's often in a somewhat negative light. If Richard Winters hadn't been Stephen Ambrose's primary source for the book, it's unlikely that Lewis Nixon would have appeared much at all in the series, let alone be one of its most prominent characters. Still, I'm glad the world has gotten to know Lewis Nixon, albeit a more likable version of him embodied by actor Ron Livingston. Though he never fired a single shot in combat, Nixon was one of the few paratroopers in the 101st to have made 3 jumps into combat zones, jumping into Normandy, Holland, and Germany, earning him 3 combat jump stars on his jump wings. He was also given a Bronze Star for running a map of German artillery positions 3 miles to Utah Beach so it could be sent up the chain of command. As Richard Winters noted, Lewis Nixon always kept his cool no matter the situation, an aspect of his character that is effectively conveyed in Band of Brothers. I still regard Lewis Nixon as the best combat officer who I had the opportunity to work with under fire, said Winters. He never showed fear, and during the toughest times, he could always think clearly and quickly. Whether Lewis Nixon's indifference was the result of his alcoholism or his own bravery is unclear. And while Lewis Nixon may have rubbed some people the wrong way and may not have been universally liked in real life, he is nonetheless a hero who served his country and is worthy of our respect. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel so you're notified when we release more Band of Brothers content. Anchors away, my friends.